Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. All together now, policies for building energy efficiency, where we're going to be hearing about policies and tools that are already being used to tackle some of the trickiest challenges to meeting our climate goals. My name is Alejandra Mejia, and I will be your moderator today. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping announcements that I am sure none of you have already heard before. Your screen is customizable. Feel free to make the various windows as large or as small as you would like. Presentations can also be downloaded as PDFs from the presentations list in the menu. You are all in listen-only mode, but can submit your questions through the Q&A box at any time during the webcast. The presenters will respond to your questions at the end of the presentations. The Q&A function can be accessed in the menu at the bottom of your screen if it's not already visible. All presentations will also be available for on-demand viewing within a few days of on this engagement hub. And later this afternoon, after the panel sessions, informal sessions and social times will be offered through Zoom links. Those links are also available through the Engagement Hub. On behalf of ACEEE, we wish to also first recognize and thank our sponsors of the event. Our gold sponsors, E for the Future, Energize Connecticut, Eversource, National Grid, SMUD, SoCal Gas, and United Illuminating. Our silver sponsors, ComEd, the Energy Coalition, the Energy Trust of Oregon, Johnson Controls, NIA, On Semiconductor, Samsung, and TRC. And our bronze sponsors, Guidehouse, the New York Power Authority, Opinion Dynamics, and VEIC. So now I would like to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers, who are Terry Sullivan with the City of Seattle, Danielle Goldberg with Synapse Energy Economics, and Jessica Miller of the Institute for Market Transformation. Before we start with the presentations, I do want to say how truly sorry I am that we can't hear from all of the authors on this panel. Please go read their excellent papers. They really will help you in your work. But these three presenters really are a great selection from that group, and we are happy to have them here representing the policy wonks of the world. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with Terry, who is active in the implementation of Seattle's building benchmarking and tune-ups policies, and this is what he's going to be telling us about today.
Thanks, Alejandra. Probably never been called distinguished before, so that's exciting for me today. As she mentioned, I work for the City of Seattle, and I'm on the team that designs and implements policies to meet our climate goals in the building sector. Today, I'll talk about the building tune-ups policy, which is one of the first policies in the nation to require that existing commercial buildings do something in their building to save energy. I'll introduce the policy to make sure everyone's familiar with the basic policy framework. And if you saw my colleague Nicole Ballinger's presentation yesterday, some of this might be a little bit repetitive, but I'll try and keep it to the basics. I'll talk about 2 or 3 things that we did in rolling out the policy that I think might be useful for other jurisdictions to hear about, and then spend most of my time talking about the initial findings from the tune-ups we're seeing to date and what we're learning about the policy overall. Wrap up with a quick summary of what we're learning. So how did we get to building tune-ups? Like many cities now, we have a carbon neutral goal by 2050 with some interim goals in 2030, now in place for about a decade. And after we implemented the benchmarking policy for a few years, we began to think, what's the next policy that we can pass to really drive building emissions down a little bit more directly? And ultimately, we settled on the tune-up policy as something that we thought could deliver on the one hand, near-term energy and emissions reductions, but at a relatively low cost for building owners. And chose that over an audit policy that we were also considering that wouldn't necessarily require specific implementation of energy reduction measures. So what is a building tune-up? At a high level, it's a pretty prescriptive set of operations and maintenance protocols, and it's targeted mostly on HVAC systems, but it also covers a lot of other important ground as well. You can see the maintenance and operating breakdown by system at the bottom there. We adapted it from PNNL, Pacific National, Northwest National Labs retuning work, and but it also borrows a little bit from retro commissioning policies and programs, and ultimately is not that different than a retro commissioning project. But the focus here is on low cost and high savings measures. We sort of cherry pick those, and no real requirements around capital equipment. PNNL's research suggests that if implemented correctly, we can see 10 to 15% energy savings in the first year. We understand that as you apply that broadly to the population of buildings, it's not necessarily going to maybe average that much, but that's what we sort of sell to building owners as what they can expect if they sort of fully commit to this. And we have the 39 measures that must be assessed. 20 are required to address if you find an error or a required correction, and then 19 are voluntary. And we use the sort of voluntary actions as sort of like, we talk about it a little bit as like a stretch code where building owners, they have to assess it. They don't necessarily have to fix it, but then we're exposing that for them, and hopefully in the future they'll address that. In addition to the 39 measures, we also require sort of a lighter audit of building systems and their condition and age, and a review of benchmarking data to make sure it's accurate. The tune-up specialist is a designation that we created in the policy development process, and they're key. They do most of the work here in the field. We try to leverage existing credentials like CEM and PE, and then set a baseline of experience of 7 years in the field or in education. And they are the crux of what happens here. They assess all of the 39 they do all the assessment. They sort of bring that back to the owner with the required corrections. Sometimes they are involved in addressing the corrections, not always, it's up to the building owner, but then they must come back and validate those fixes and are responsible for the reporting back to the city. So they really are important in getting this right. The policy covers buildings 50,000 square feet and larger, broken out into these 4 cohorts that you see there. Importantly, it's done every 5 years, so it's not just a one-time deal. We're trying to set this as the baseline expectation for what buildings have to do to manage their energy use in the city. And then we use a tiered fine structure, which you can see there at the bottom, with a grace period of 6 months after the deadline, a more lenient fine up front, and then a heavier fine on the back end to sort of make sure that work is done. And then finally, we do have some off-ramps to allow for exemplary performance, waivers and extensions to allow flexibility, but really the vast majority of buildings will do a tune-up, and that's what we're hoping. So that's the real fast tune-ups 101. Plenty more details if you want, but essentially what we're talking about is a mandatory prescriptive O&M regimen that's every 5 years by a qualified professional. So 2 or 3 notes about the policy rollout before I get into the results. This is my policy implementation PSA, which we like to do every time we do a presentation. That, passing climate policy is what we're all here to talk about. It's exciting, but I'm here to talk about the sort of long slog of implementing policies effectively, and that's going to become more and more important as we pass more aggressive policies and have these longer timelines and achieve trying to get these deep savings that we need to meet the climate crisis. So I'm here for the climate policy, but also here for the long slog, I guess. But one element of how we rolled out the policy that I thought was extremely beneficial, we learned a lot from, was requiring municipal buildings to comply a year in advance. This sort of set up a suite of demonstration projects that we could bring to the public with some sort of lessons learned. It allowed us to vet our internal processes and save the city a bunch of money and reduce carbon. If you saw my colleague Nicole's presentation yesterday, you learned about the DOE-funded accelerator program, and this also sort of did a lot to accelerate the implementation of this policy. Gave incentives to these harder-to-reach buildings under 100,000 square feet, 102 of them, and provided technical assistance as well. It really allowed us to learn a lot about how to do this right and do this right for those harder-to-reach buildings. And that sort of, and one other thing which I wanted to talk a little bit about was just that we took on this policy on the benchmarking team and on implement them in concert. I think that's done a lot to sort of help us ramp up quickly and understand how to do these kind of policies and do them effectively. But really, I want to jump into the tune-ups and what we're learning. We have a big influx of tune-ups in the past year and a half after sort of a slow trickle to start, and now have over 300 tune-ups submitted in the first two cohorts of buildings. And if you count the accelerator, well over 400. I'll talk about some summary stats. I don't have a ton of data to share on impact estimates just yet. That's something we'll have to do in the future, but we're going to talk a little bit about compliance and what people are finding in the building and some things that we think are useful to share. So first, here on compliance, this graph shows compliance at 4 key stages in the process: alternative compliance, tune-up due date, and the 2 fine dates. So it's a long, year and a half long process. And I think if you stopped and looked in March 2019 and saw a first-year policy compliance rate of 35%, you wouldn't think that's too great, but ultimately a year later we end up with a 96%, 97% now compliance rate. So that, I think, what became obvious really quickly was just how long the process is. It's not just a tune-up where the tune-up specialist has to be, the building has to be aware that there's a policy, the tune-up specialist is hired and gets into the building, gets all this feedback back to the ownership. They do all the work. It's just a really long process in the field, but also some back and forth in the review process of something that's submitted that's so complicated. And so I call this the long road to high compliance. And for us, it's highlighted 2 high-level findings. One is that the deadlines and the grace periods, as structured in the policy design, worked pretty well. The initial 6-month grace period that allowed for the tune-up specialist, and along with the lower first fine, allowed the tune-up specialist to keep working well after the deadline to keep tune-ups coming in. We also had enough flexibility built into the policy where our director and our program management team could be a little bit flexible with how we manage all this to sort of keep encouraging tune-ups being done and not just immediately fine everyone. And the back end, the fine on the back end was strong enough that people didn't just end up paying the fine. This might be obvious to a lot of you program implementers out there, but start educating the market early and often. We knew this going into the policy, but even with almost 3 years of presentations to all different kinds of organizations and outreach to management and ownership trainings, all of that before the first due date, we still had buildings just getting started at the due date and used up the full grace period and fine period to get things done. So it highlighted for us how many buildings are out there that aren't necessarily actively engaged in tracking this kind of stuff and all the work that has to be done to sort of reach these folks when you're doing a mandate like this. Moving on to what tune-up specialists are finding in the building. So far, across the sort of 300 tune-ups we've seen in the past year and a half, we're seeing an average of about 8 corrections identified. Most of those are required and are then therefore implemented. Most of these are on the HVAC side, and we're seeing some pretty consistent findings across what people are seeing the most in all these different building sizes. 9 out of the top 10 were HVAC, higher rates of operations measures, a little bit higher adoption in the first cohort versus the second cohort. The first cohort, the top there, 200,000 square foot and larger, and the second cohort, 100 to 199. And most of these measures that you see on the screen here, set points, controls, adjusting schedules for efficient operation, we expect to be some of the bigger savings opportunities, at least from what we've seen in our buildings and the research from PNNL. So that's promising. Hopefully we see that in the impact estimates later this year. On the voluntary side, my colleague Nicole talked about this a little bit yesterday. We see a ton of equipment and lighting replacement opportunities being uncovered here. We don't ultimately expect that when someone's doing a tune-up, they're going to just jump in and replace all their inefficient equipment, all their inefficient lighting. But what this is doing for us, you can see the adoption rate in dark versus the identified rate in the lighter color there. But what it highlights is the opportunity for owners to learn more about their building, and it gives us a ton of useful data to design better policies moving forward. So some takeaways from that, building other jurisdictions in Seattle, we can consider, I talked about voluntary measures as sort of a stretch code. We can consider adopting more of these voluntary measures as mandatory if we want to try and drive some higher savings. We can use this data for electrification efforts more directly if we learn more about the buildings. But just learning a lot about these buildings has been super useful so far. Since I don't have a ton of time, I'll skip ahead to one of my favorite findings so far, at least from my perspective, as we try and improve the program moving forward. And that's that we're seeing some pretty high variance in the average number of findings by our tune-up specialists. Might be a lot to consume here, but I have the 7 tune-up specialists who have submitted the most tune-ups to date, which just these 7 tune-up specialists have done almost half the tune-ups so far. So there's sort of a lot of concentration in just these 7 folks. At the top, tune-up specialist 1, I show the number of tune-ups and the average findings, corrections identified per building, and then the bubble sizes, how many tune-ups they submitted with that number of corrections identified. And basically what we see is tune-up specialist 1 has done 30 tune-ups and only twice found below the citywide average of 7.8 corrections. And then on the other end of the spectrum, tune-up specialists 6 and 7 are over the course of 50 tune-ups submitted only twice over the average number. So there's a lot here to unpack, and we still have to sort of see how this impacts any sort of energy savings outcomes. But what we are and have been worried for a long time about what we call the race to the bottom, where a tune-up specialist can conceivably offer a cheap tune-up at a low cost, take on a lot of work, and we don't really have any sort of formal QC or audit mechanisms to intervene, at least right now. And so there's a need for increased consistency across tune-up specialists. We can do some of that through better and more training, and we'll try and do that in the future. But other cities might have to think more about this as we do these more complex interventions that rely on folks in the field that aren't necessarily connected directly to the jurisdiction implementing the policy. And since I don't have impact estimates just yet, we can at least talk about some of the anecdotal evidence we're seeing energy savings in our own buildings. Municipal buildings have seen as high as 20% energy savings in the first year, where we've done 1 or 2 extra voluntary measures. Through some of the early evaluation work we did, we talked to a lot of tune-up specialists and gotten mostly positive feedback on what clients are seeing in the field. So there's at least some initial evidence that this is working in buildings to save energy. Some quick takeaways to wrap things up. As I mentioned a couple different ways, there's a lot we can do, and a lot of other jurisdictions can do to sort of drive higher savings in a policy like this. Figuring out more consistency in your qualified professionals, in our case, tune-up specialists, and better training to drive consistency and better execution in the field. Cities can consider ways to target utility incentives using this data on equipment and lighting replacement opportunities. We can also do more, I think, and other cities might find ways to deal with this better, but thinking more about persistence of these measures as we go on a 5-year cycle. There's a lot of time in between, especially when there's an event like COVID, for these measures to sort of fall off. And so other cities can explore options to sort of check in or intervene in the interim, so that the savings drop off isn't too steep. Outreach and education, I mentioned this earlier, never ends. We use benchmarking data a lot, benchmarking contact data, and our experience with outreach to sort of jumpstart our outreach. But again, it's so hard to reach these building owners and managers and sort of get them aware of these policies and moving quickly to sort of comply early. And defining training requirements for tune-up specialists or your qualified professionals is important. And we'll do more of that moving forward as we sort of go on to the next round of tune-ups. One small note on process support. I think it's important for complex policies to think not just about technical support. We thought going into this, there would be a ton of questions about the O&M specifics, the protocols in the building systems, but a lot of what we get is just about the complex policy and how to navigate that, about IT process issues and clarifying requirements and buildings, all kinds of clarification questions. So just a note that, technical assistance is essential, but it's not always so technical that you need sort of all these CEMs and whatnot to answer every single question. So you might need to, in these kind of complex policies moving forward, think about how to navigate both of those worlds. And I think importantly, we've talked a lot at this conference about building performance standards. And small number of U.S. cities now have these in place. A lot more are considering them. State of Washington, where we live, as not just an EUI-based performance standard now, but also based on ASHRAE 100, a prescriptive O&M regimen, a little sort of light strategic energy management component on top of the benchmarking requirement. And so this is forcing us to consider sort of how this type of policy fits in that world. And so, we're spending a lot of time thinking about how to make adjustments to the policy to make it work better, to drive greater greenhouse gas emissions reductions. But regardless, regardless of how all that plays out, the tune-up policy has been a great first step for us in regulating energy in existing buildings at this sort of scale. I think it so far been successful in engaging the right people in the market and starting to transform behavior. And I think we've learned a lot and now have a foundation to build on, like with benchmarking before, and can hopefully take that next step in reducing our emissions in the near future. Thanks for letting me come talk to you today.
Great. Thanks, Terry. So before moving on to the next presentation, I do want to remind the attendees that you can put in your questions using the Q&A box at the throughout the presentations. That Q&A box can be accessed at the menu at the bottom of your screen if it's not already up. And Cody, my panel co-leader, is going to be collecting those questions, and we'll be asking them of the presenters once all three presentations are concluded. So next we have Danielle Goldberg, who is a consultant with Synapse Energy Economics, and she is here to tell us about what it really means to be in a new era of load growth. Go ahead, Danielle.
Thanks so much, and thanks to ACEEE for putting this on and having me here. Thanks to my co-presenters and all of you guys for watching. This is very exciting. So this presentation is called A New Era of Load Growth, Preparing for the Rise of Heat Pumps and Electric Vehicles in New England, based on a paper written by Synapse for E for the Future. And I've listed the co-authors on the slide right here: Jason Frost, Doug Hurley, and Kenji Takahashi. So just a little bit about Synapse Energy Economics. We are a research and consulting firm of around 30 consultants. Synapse has provided support for various client groups, including consumer, environmental advocates, governmental agencies, and others for almost 25 years. For the majority of its existence, Synapse has represented various clients in New England's electricity markets. As we all envision a carbon-free future, electrification has become the hot topic. Electrification is a key strategy to reducing emissions and shifting away from fossil fuel reliance. Heat pumps and electric vehicles have gained traction as two technologies that will help that vision become a reality. Other technologies will need to go through this transformation as well, but we focus on heat pumps and electric vehicles in this presentation because they are currently positioned to have the greatest impact on the electric grid. Up until now, implementation has been fairly slow, but a combination of forward-looking policies and technology improvements may change that. Our question is, does increased electrification pose a threat to New England's electric grid within the next decade? We wanted this question not only to address the scenario New England is currently on track for, but also a scenario in which electrification adoption aligns with state-by-state climate goals. We framed our analysis in the context of ISO New England's most recent SELT forecast as a basis for the current loads expected on the system. For those who are not familiar, the SELT forecast is the capacity, energy, load, and transmission forecast. In this presentation, I will walk through our independent forecast for thermal and transportation electrification throughout the next decade. This analysis answers key questions about electrification within the next decade, specifically whether it will pose a threat to the existing system in New England. Using publicly available sources, we developed forecasts for heat pumps and electric vehicles. For each technology, we look at low, mid, and high scenarios for adoption based on a range of sources. we calculated energy and demand impacts for each technology. We focused the analysis on annual energy consumption and peak demand during the winter, which is the season we predict electrification will have the greatest impact. All of this leads into the question, is our electric system prepared to handle electrification? We kept the analysis at the transmission level rather than including distribution impacts because of a lack of location-specific data, but we'll touch a little bit more on that later. We intend to show what the next decade will look like in New England and how policymakers should view the challenge of electrification. I'll begin by talking about our heat pump analysis, then our EV analysis, and finally how the combined results relate to the regional load forecasts. We're starting with heat pumps. Diving into our three scenarios, I just wanted to touch on some of the heat pump assumptions we used. When we discuss heat pumps, we are referring to air source heat pumps for space heating exclusively. There may be other heat pump technologies that gain traction throughout the next decade, but air source heat pumps are by far the most popular. Most of the units assume that a customer will be fuel switching away from their existing fuel, such as oil or propane, and therefore increasing electric usage. But we also included customers switching from inefficient electric resistance heating in our analysis. These adoption scenarios represent a range of use cases, which I will discuss more on the next slide. So we developed low, mid, and high scenarios in our analysis, each based on different data sets. The BAU, or business as usual scenario, assumes state-sponsored energy efficiency programs will implement the existing state-by-state plans. Typically, these plans only contain data for the next 2 or 3 years, in which case we assumed a modest program increase throughout the next decade. By the end of the decade, we expect the region will install around 700,000 heat pumps in this low scenario. The next scenario we looked at was based on policy. These numbers were typically extracted from state energy plans or pledges from leadership, and we think these numbers reflect the higher end of a likely scenario. We anticipate over 1 million heat pumps in this scenario. Then lastly, we looked at a scenario that reflects greenhouse gas emissions reductions goals by state. I've included a figure on the slide showing greenhouse gas reduction goals by 2030. So if they were meant for a different year, they've been modified to reflect 2030. This scenario is meant to be illustrative based on the number of homes that need to convert to heat pumps. The greenhouse gas scenario is more than double the policy scenario at nearly 2.5 million heat pumps. We are not currently on track to hit this greenhouse gas target scenario. We developed per heat pump load calculations to reflect a range of use cases: full replacement fuel switching, partial replacement fuel switching, and full replacement electric resistance heating. To develop per heat pump load calculations, we decided to use publicly available evaluation studies. Not every state had available evaluation studies, so we ended up grouping the region into northern and southern New England. For northern New England, we used a 2014 EMI consulting study for Maine and a 2017 Cadmus Group study for Vermont. Both studies combined a series of use cases that were representative of existing systems, including full replacement, partial replacement, and electric resistance heating. For southern New England, we used a 2018 Navigant study designed for the Massachusetts 3-year energy efficiency plan. Rather than a value blended for the different use cases, as was the case for northern New England, this study had values for different use cases separated, which we aggregated based on an assumed 50-50 split between full and partial replacement systems. We also assumed a percentage of electric resistance cases based on the varied populations with electrically heated homes. The values do range quite a bit between the two regions because of varied assumptions. Heat pump installation practices are evolving quickly, and homes with heat pumps installed in the last several years may already use somewhat outdated practices, both from the installation perspective and the customer use case perspective. For instance, we are seeing larger units installed and more customer reliance on the heat pump instead of on the backup system. This was a risk with using existing evaluation studies from several years ago. As we get more updated consumption data based on newer installation practices throughout the region, we'll be able to update these per unit numbers, and they should be able to look more similar in the north and south based on what we're seeing from the existing studies. Next, we move on to our electric vehicle analysis. EVs are not typically incentivized along with traditional energy efficiency programs. And while some states do offer incentives for EVs, they are typically aimed at generally increasing market adoption rather than targeting specific sales. Also, while heat pumps often have state-by-state goals, electric vehicles are not especially segmented, which led us to look at New England as a region. This analysis looks only at light-duty vehicles. It incorporates both all-electric battery EVs and plug-in hybrid EVs. But over time, we expect the percentage of all-electric battery EVs to increase. Once again, we developed 3 scenarios, low, mid, and high. The low scenario is based on EIA's annual energy outlook. We think this is a conservative estimate because of high battery costs that stay high throughout the next 10 years. This scenario estimates 300,000 EV sales in the next decade. The mid scenario is the scenario used by the Transformation Climate Initiative, which uses EIA's NEMS model. And importantly, this scenario updates battery costs to decrease over time. This scenario estimates over 800,000 EVs sold. Similar to the heat pump analysis, the high scenario assumes states are on track to meet their climate goals. This would mean over half of new vehicles sold are electric vehicles by the end of the decade. The 10-year sales forecast is around 1.5 million. For energy calculations, we used Synapse's in-house tool, EV Ready. EV Ready calculates the number of EVs on the road, and then using vehicle miles driven, lifetimes, and efficiency, it calculates annual EV consumption. Demand calculations, however, are trickier because they are more dependent on charging behavior. We looked at 2 options, unmanaged charging and managed charging. Unmanaged means charging behavior remains the same as it is today, and we got data from ChargePoint to inform this scenario. While unmanaged charging profiles may evolve over time, we think this is representative of the next decade. Managed charging means there is a policy, program, rate design, or incentives that motivates customers to charge and discharge at times that are convenient for the electrical grid. Note that we did not try to do any analysis in this report about what policy or what that policy or program would be, but rather used an illustrative load profile from Cal ETC. Additional research into managed charging options would be very valuable. We also did not specifically analyze other benefits from EVs, such as vehicle to grid, but we'll touch a little bit more on that later. Next, we go into the combined results for heat pumps and electric vehicles in the context of New England's electric grid. So this graph shows the 3 scenarios, low, mid, and high, separated into heat pumps and electric vehicles. The lighter color is heat pumps, and the darker color is EVs. On the right axis, you can see the annual increase in energy in terawatt hours, whereas the left axis is the percent increase over the net CELT forecast for energy. And by net forecast, we mean it includes reductions from energy efficiency and solar PV. The low and mid scenarios present what the region is most likely on track to see, which is a combined increase of between 3 and 7% of annual energy consumption. We are not currently on track to hit that high climate case, but if we were, that would be an increase of 13%. It's also important to note that the increases grow each year, presenting uncertainty about 2030 and beyond. So this slide shows a similar graph, but for winter demand. This graph shows unmanaged charging profiles for electric vehicles, which is very important. So with unmanaged charging, winter demand increases from EVs makes up approximately 2/3 of the combined impacts. So the combined results would increase winter demand from 3 to 11%. Again, we're not currently on track for that 11%, so more like 3 to 6%. Now, this slide is the exact same, except for it presents the managed charging profiles for electric vehicles. You can see that the impact from EVs shrinks considerably, with individual impacts for each scenario under 1%. With managed charging, the total increase in winter demand from both technologies is between 1 and 5%, but again, more realistically, between 1 and 2%. So I just want to emphasize the difference between unmanaged and managed charging. The solid lines on the graph are unmanaged, while the dotted lines are managed. Managed charging can take on many forms, and as a reminder, we only demonstrated one illustrative load profile. But managed charging can provide a wide array of benefits, some of which I've listed there. So this includes flexible storage, transmission, and distribution capacity benefits, ancillary services, and lower consumer costs. Reducing peak demand on the system reduces generation, transmission, and distribution costs that make the system less costly to operate. It would also reduce reliance on inefficient peaker plants and help reduce emissions. Lastly, we think it would be a waste to have this much energy storage on the grid and leave it unused. So how well prepared is the grid to handle electrification? To answer this, it's important to remember New England is a summer peaking system. That means all resources and infrastructure are procured to meet summer demand. Summer demand is expected to be about 5,000 megawatts higher than winter demand throughout the whole next decade, absent any electrification. So we tried to look at our results within that context. Our scenarios show an increase of winter demand between 250 megawatts, and this would be the low scenario with managed EV charging, and 2,200 megawatts, and this would be the high scenario for both technologies with unmanaged EV charging. By the end of as such, our system as it currently exists, should be well suited to handle this transformation. New England is also expecting to see over 5,000 megawatts of offshore wind projects, which is a great winter resource. The SELT forecast predicts continued growth of traditional energy efficiency programs, and more efficient and flexible demand resources are likely to become more prevalent on the grid as well. So our analysis shows that the electric grid is prepared for electrification through 2030, but what's next? If the region ramps up electrification more rapidly after 2030, as many experts agree will be necessary for our carbon-free future, New England must prepare for a winter peaking future. This means using this decade to develop well-thought-out plans for how to upgrade our system, including managed EV charging, investigating location-specific distribution constraints, and continuing to invest heavily in energy efficiency, technology, and other demand-side resources. So here are the main takeaways we hope that you got from the presentation. Policymakers should not shy away from ambitious electrification policies over concern for the electric grid within the next decade. We should, however, use this opportunity to plan strategically for the following decades in which New England may, in fact, become winter peaking. New England is not currently on track to meet its climate goals associated with electrification. Next, managed EV charging can drastically reduce the impacts of EVs, but also create significant benefits for the grid, which is one of many reasons to explore what different managed charging scenarios. And then lastly, continued investment in traditional energy efficiency, demand-side resources, and renewables will be key for a successful transition into a cleaner heating and transportation future. So thank you all for listening. I've included a link to the full report below. If you have any questions or want to discuss this analysis, I am more than happy to. Thanks.
Thanks, Danielle. And finally, we have Jessica Miller with the Institute for Market Transformation, where she works directly with cities to design and implement policies. And Jessica is going to close us out with a very important discussion about understanding equity risk so that we can have building policies that truly benefit all. Let me find your slides, Jessica. there you go. Go ahead.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Alejandra. And again, my name is Jessica Miller from the Institute for Market Transformation. And I'm going to be talking today about the risks to multifamily affordable housing in the context of building performance standards, and how cities can start to work towards solutions to those risks. So I'd like to first give credit to my co-authors, which were listed on the first slide, which I'm not sure you can see, but I worked with several of my colleagues at IMT, as well as Bridget Neely from Firefly Consulting. So I'm going to start by talking through the context around where this risk is coming from, and then describe an analysis that we did for the purposes of this paper to estimate the scale of the potential risk. And then I'll end with an overview of our recommendations for how cities, states, and policymakers can better protect affordability in the context of a performance policy. So building performance standards, if you haven't heard, are an aggressive policy tool aimed at reducing energy use and emissions from existing buildings. And I just want to underline again that the focus here is on existing buildings, not new construction. In their current form, building performance standard policies set mandates that buildings over a certain size must not exceed either an energy or carbon-based performance target, which continues to decrease over time. So buildings that do not meet that standard would be required to invest in upgrades that will improve the performance of the building and reduce energy use and building emissions. So while this type of regulation is really exciting and necessary to meet the critical point where we are in the climate crisis, this type of mandated investment could pose a significant risk to the viability of affordable housing and result in some serious unintended consequences like tenant displacement or the further loss of affordable units in our cities without thoughtful policy design. The severity of this risk has already and could lead policymakers to consider exempting affordable housing from complying with the law. But this approach leaves affordable owners and tenants out of the benefits of energy efficiency investment, potentially deepening existing inequities. So there are building performance standard policies already on the books in New York City, Washington, D.C., Washington State, and most recently St. Louis, which passed their standard earlier this year. We are currently working with a number of other cities around the country that are putting plans in place to follow suit. So it's a critical time to figure out how to address these risks to affordable housing right now. Okay, so when we are talking about multifamily affordable housing, which is a mouthful, it is critical to understand that this is not a homogeneous group, but it's a really complex and layered market segment where the nuances of how the types of housing are structured really matter. And in the context of a performance policy, the implications of the policy will be different based on the type of housing you were talking about. So for the purposes of our analysis, we segmented multifamily affordable housing into these three subcategories. So privately owned subsidized, public housing, and then unsubsidized, which is sometimes called naturally occurring or NOAA. So I might say that throughout the presentation, NOAA. This is important because each category of housing faces different types of challenges around making investments. So on the privately owned subsidized housing side, those properties are typically subject to complex and restrictive financial arrangements, and there are only limited times when they have the access to capital that they need to make upgrades during refinancing periods, and their ability to wrap in energy improvements depends on lender buy-in. On the NOAA side, this is where the big risk to tenants comes into play, where they can face increased rents when owners need to recoup their costs for investing in building upgrades. On sort of all sides of the equation, these buildings typically generate low cash flow, meaning that few have kind of reserves in the bank to cover the costs of the energy improvements that would be needed to comply, and to further complicate things, many subsidized buildings also receive utility allowances, which presents another barrier for owners to recoup the costs of investments to improve energy efficiency. And last, kind of the often kind of discussed but still notable challenge for these buildings is often operating on low margins and having less capacity to bring on staff with expertise in energy efficiency. Makes it more difficult to execute a plan and improve operations in these buildings compared to what we see on the commercial or market rate side. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about how we did our analysis and what it showed us. So the goal again was to start to understand sort of an order of magnitude impact that a building performance standard policy could have on different categories of affordable multifamily housing, and then start to identify any trends and tools that can help inform policy design to both minimize risks and also maximize benefits. Okay, so we picked 3 cities with an attempt to have some diversity in terms of population size and climate zone. Those characteristics are just merely descriptive. They weren't really used in the analysis. The cities were anonymized for the purposes of the paper for a couple of reasons. One, we didn't want the results to be taken out of context and used to argue against adoption of this type of policy, but also because it was really difficult to confirm some of the numbers that came out of our analysis, which is a limitation of the work, but also underscores just how difficult it is to get good data in this space. So in order to get the numbers in each category, in each city, we replicated the process developed by the National Housing Trust for the analysis that they did on the multifamily affordable stock in Washington, D.C. For the purposes of informing the rulemaking part of the building performance standard process that they're currently in. So we used the National Housing Preservation Database and CoStar. And as I mentioned, we attempted to do some kind of behind the scenes cross-checking of those numbers as well. So NHPD provided the numbers for the subsidized units, and we used CoStar's star rating system as a proxy means of identifying naturally occurring affordable housing. So the NOAA segment, if you don't work in the affordable space, is particularly difficult to quantify, as there are no sort of central tracking or monitoring mechanisms like there are in the subsidized market. So again, this results in a really rough estimate, which is appropriate for planning purposes, but rough nonetheless. We looked at the number of buildings and units that would be impacted by a policy that had a square footage threshold of 50,000 square feet and then ramped down to 25,000 square feet. So meaning buildings under this size are not covered by the policy and therefore are not part of this analysis. I just wanted to note that while 25,000 square feet and 50,000 square feet are common thresholds for performance policies to date, cities may be making different decisions around that, and this type of analysis could help in the early stage make that decision by sort of showing what the impact would be on this housing stock. So the paper includes a much more detailed look into the data by city, but I'm just going to talk today about the main findings. So the analysis showed that in all three cities, it is likely that nearly all of the subsidized units, both privately owned and public housing, would likely be impacted by a building performance standard as the size threshold for square footage decreases. So on the positive side, residents will be included in the benefits of efficiency. And because subsidized buildings typically include restrictions on raising rents, the risk to the viability of those properties can likely be mitigated through flexible compliance schedules and pathways, which I will talk more about later on. But the numbers also surfaced another interesting but maybe not surprising trend, that subsidized units in these three cities that we looked at comprise only a fraction of the total number of affordable housing units in those cities. So what that means in turn is that the NOAA buildings and units may not be touched by the policy, and therefore residents in those buildings may be left out of the benefits. What this kind of leads us to emphasize is just how critical NOAA stakeholders are to engage in the policy design process. And that means that policymakers must dedicate resources and time to engage with community-based organizations so that they can help co-design solutions. Okay, so our paper did not take the next step with this analysis to estimate the cost to comply in the cities that we analyzed. However, that would be an important use for the results of this type of analysis in order for cities and other jurisdictions to start to understand the scale of support that will be needed to help these buildings comply. In the paper, we looked at the work of the Building Energy Exchange, who analyzed the data acquired from New York City's energy audit law to develop cost estimates for common retrofit packages as a starting point to start to estimate the cost of compliance. Jurisdictions that have the resources to hire a consultant should work with experts to create estimates of common energy conservation measure packages and their costs and paybacks that are more specific to the local market. Jurisdictions that don't have access to those types of resources could look at the New York City analysis, pair it with local benchmarking data if that's available, and then potentially use a costing tool like RS Means to scale construction costs to local averages to start to hone in on cost estimates to comply. So last, just taking a step back from the analysis that we did and the results, I'm going to discuss some ideas to support affordable housing in the context of a building performance standard that all jurisdictions can apply to the policy design process. So again, the first step is really to undertake as comprehensive of an assessment as you can of the local affordable housing landscape, and pair that assessment with an inventory of existing resources that are in place to support affordable owners, as well as pairing that with a stakeholder engagement process to uncover the limitations of the resources that currently exist in the market. In the actual policy design, there are different ways to accommodate the unique needs of multifamily affordable housing. But to start, I want to again emphasize the importance of a meaningful stakeholder engagement process to inform a locally sourced policy design. The first bucket of recommendations here is to build flexibility into the compliance paths of the policy. One idea that we have is instead of requiring multifamily affordable housing to meet a certain standard, so whether that's an EUI or a carbon emissions target, you can instead require them to narrow the gap between their current performance and the standard by a certain percentage. Another recommendation is to incentivize properties that perform better than the set standard by pushing out their next compliance deadline as a way to encourage deep retrofits early on. The next category of recommendations is to build in options for affordable properties to delay compliance, and that delay compliance language is kind of a great term, in my opinion, that Washington, D.C. used in their law. And this can be done either by granting additional time to comply, which is what St. Louis has done in their ordinance, or by allowing the opportunity for owners to defer compliance through some type of documented process. The intent of these measures is to allow owners to align the timing for investment with refinancing periods, which again may be the only time these owners have the access to capital required to make energy efficiency upgrades. In all of these cases, it's important to track the reasons for delayed compliance and prioritize these buildings for additional technical and financial assistance, if at all possible. The third category of action is focused on identifying possible solutions and additional resources. I think I'm running short on time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. But these are basically kind of things to wrap around the policy. So aligning existing support programs with the BPS targets and timelines. If those opportunities aren't there in a current market or in a particular market, work to create those types of programs that at a minimum include both technical and financial resources, ideally sort of under one roof. All the cities that have passed BPS either have or have started a process to stand up a high-performing buildings resource hub to support policy compliance. Cities can work with local CDFIs and lenders to establish programs that help owners comply, which is a particular need to help smaller properties access capital. And then last, whether as part of a performance policy or as a complement, we would urge cities to protect vulnerable tenants from rent increases and displacement by exploring regulatory means such as rent increase or eviction protections, or by placing conditions for sale on non-compliant properties. So just to end, it is in that way that a building performance standard can evolve to not just mitigate risks on critical issues like affordability, but can also start to touch on a broader policy agenda that includes additional social priorities. So I will stop there. Thank you again for your time, and please feel free to send me an email if you'd like to connect about this work, and I'm looking forward to your questions. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Jessica. So let's move into the Q&A portion of our session here. I'm Cody Taylor, and joining us for these three excellent discussions we just had. I'd like to invite all of our presenters to turn your cameras back on, and for the next 15 minutes or so, we can have a discussion between us. I appreciate everybody who has put questions into the chat box, and I've been monitoring those, and we'll try to get through some of the highlights there in the time we have. So with that, I'd like to please start with a question for Jessica on the last presentation we just heard. So Jessica, as you're talking about these potential strategies for mitigating negative impacts on affordable housing, how do the strategies differ for properties where owners pay the utilities versus those where tenants pay utilities? Is that a axis of difference in approach?
Yeah, I think as part of understanding what's typical in the market where the policy is going to be in play, that's a really critical piece to understand, sort of typical metering structures and how those benefits, either go to owners or go to tenants. I think that's certainly an important point of that sort of gap assessment, market understanding piece that we recommended.
Thank you. And also along those lines, which types of affordable housing do you find were most important to be targeted? Some of the other funding assistance and the like to avoid affordable housing loss or other negative impacts. Was there any difference there between NOAA and subsidized?
Yeah, well, I think we sort of understand that the risk to the naturally occurring stock is potentially a bit more severe because they don't have those affordability restrictions in place, sort of that come with some of the subsidies on the subsidized side. So with owners needing to invest to meet a performance policy, that could lead to rent increases, which could lead to displacement, could lead to building turnover and that type of thing. We also know that NOAA buildings typically have maybe smaller ownership structures or maybe more of a mom and pop type of an ownership model, and may not have sort of the access to capital or the staff capacity to know where to go for that type of capital. So I think that market segment is a big focus, and I know a lot of different sort of players in this space are working on that as we speak.
Great, thank you. And along those lines too, for delaying compliance for affordable housing as a strategy to ease the burden on affordable housing, is there a differentiation that impact naturally occurring versus subsidized housing? Is it more effective at mitigating impacts on one or the other?
I would think that the delaying compliance is sort of positioned at meeting the needs of subsidized buildings, which typically have sort of strict refinancing periods. So the idea would be to allow owners to kind of align when they need to make investments to meet the performance standard with other work that they're doing as part of a refinancing package of upgrades. With the NOAA stock, I think it's potential that delaying compliance could support them, but I think it's really more sort of speaking to that subsidized side with the mid-cycle timing.
Thank you. And a last question in this segment. What does your analysis suggest at the end of the day for cities thinking about what size threshold square is appropriate for building performance standards? You mentioned that different size thresholds may have different impacts on affordable housing. Did you have any overall finding on that?
We didn't have an overall finding of that in the paper. I think, based on, just my work in the space, I think one of the most significant considerations around size threshold in the policy is really the resources a city might have to implement this policy in a way that will make it successful. So I think Terry touched on this a bit with Seattle's work, but the smaller the square footage threshold, the more buildings are covered. So a city or other jurisdiction department that's going to be implementing the policy needs to sort of scale, staff and resources to accommodate the number of buildings that are going to be touched. And as we saw in the analysis, that a lot of NOAA buildings are typically smaller, and as the square footage decreases, outreach to those owners, is more and more difficult as sort of the square footage threshold decreases. So those are all just things to consider.
Great, thank you. I'm going to start moving the questions around a little bit. So let's, Danielle. Danielle, you talked about managed charging a fair amount and described to us some of the significant impact that managed charging can make versus unmanaged in the electrification impacts. We didn't hear much about load shifting on the heat pump side, which I think is an equivalent strategy. Can you tell us a little about how load shifting, if it was considered, and how much difference that makes in outcomes compared to managed?
Sure. So what we did for the heat pump analysis when we looked at these existing evaluation studies is we looked at peak demand, which was defined as the peak period as ISO New England defines it, which I think is maybe 5 to 7 p.m. December and January. So these were numbers that were already put out in the study. So we did not specifically look at load shifting for heat pumps, although I think that's a super interesting question. And we only talked about heat pumps and electric vehicles, but there's so much opportunity to pair other things with these two technologies, such as batteries, I think would be great for that. And when I talked about the impact that managed EV charging can have, a lot of those impacts were just impacts of reducing peak demand in New England. And that could apply based on load shifting for either technology. It doesn't have to be electric vehicles. I think that electric vehicles are unique in that they can be both a resource that consumes and a resource that stores, which was something that we found particularly interesting. But heat pumps have lots of other great opportunities, such as preheating, things like that, that we did not investigate in this study, but is a really interesting topic and one that we would love to learn more about. So thanks for asking that question.
All thanks go to your audience members out there in the ether. So thanks to everybody out there for submitting helpful questions here. There was another question, Danielle, about distribution level grid impacts. We're primarily talking at the sort of wholesale level. Can you talk a little more about whether there are significant impacts that appear over the next decade at the distribution level, assuming there's sort of a differentiated rollout of these key demand side electrification technologies?
Yeah, so that is something that was outside of the scope of the study, but something that I think is very interesting is when we looked at energy efficiency, we included it as a blanket reduction across all of New England. And that was included in those SELT forecasts that I presented on all of the graphs because they were net forecasts. But I think that energy efficiency is a great resource that can be deployed at locations that would help alleviate that constraint. But that's not to say that it could do this for us. I think that one of the main takeaways is that distribution constraints need to be looked at when we know more specifically where these technologies are being rolled out. So we didn't have that data when we did this analysis, but that's one of the topics that we've talked a fair amount about, just as something we're very interested in pursuing. And hopefully as we get more location-specific data, which I think can relate to both the consumption side, which I touched on a little bit with the existing evaluation studies, and just the number of heat pumps that are being deployed. When there's more location-specific information about that, I think that would be very valuable to know, and something that it's likely that we should start working on now, even if the conclusions showed that the transmission system is likely well suited to handle the loads that we expect to see.
That's great, thank you. And it's a good segue into another audience question around interaction of energy efficiency with electrification, as you talked about. So you talked a little about deploying EE locationally where there's potential for equipment to be reaching its limits and need upgrade, and to mitigate the need for that upgrade. Can you talk a little more about any other thoughts you have on pairing EE with electrification? Is there anything there that jumped out as particular strategies based on your analysis?
Yeah, I think something that might be helpful, and I think a lot of utility-run programs already do this, is when they install something like a heat pump, they make sure that the home has gone through a home energy audit already, because all of these technologies will work best if your home is well insulated. And I think that's definitely the biggest one for heat pumps. If your home is well insulated, you're using your heat pumps to the best possible efficiency, which is obviously what we want to achieve. So I think that's kind of an obvious example of energy efficiency being paired with heat pumps specifically. I'll try to think of more that come to mind. I mean, I think we're probably, based on this conference, all on the same page that more energy efficiency is better wherever we can install it. But that's just one example of how that pairs with this particular technology.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to move to a couple questions for Terry in Seattle now. Can you just say a few words about who employs the tune-up specialists? There were a number of questions around your presentation about who they work for, whether it's the city or independent contractors, et cetera, kind of how those tune-up specialists are trained and credentialed, and how you thought in general about developing the workforce to serve the policy as you put it in place.
Sure, yeah. The tune-up specialists, we do a number of trainings. The accelerator did a couple 2-day trainings that covered the technical aspect of what a tune-up is, the policy aspect of what they need to do to comply, the processes. And so the training that the city provides is sort of specific to educating the market on what a tune-up is and what we're asking for in the buildings and how to comply. But the tune-up specialists sort of need to have their own credentials. We have a list of 7 or 8 different existing credentials that they must have, and they must have the minimum experience as well. So we're not providing their bulk of their technical expertise. They're bringing that to the table. And the tune-up specialist is hired by the building owner. They can use internal staff if they want to, if they have someone that's qualified internally and can do the work. Most people hire a third-party provider. And coming into the policy, we thought internal tune-up specialists might be a risk. We weren't really sure if we really needed them all to be, external third-party, sort of independent. But we've seen far better results from internal tune-up specialists, the few that have been submitting tune-ups. I'm not sure if that's, just unique to a couple situations we've seen in sort of institutions doing really good tune-ups that have internal folks doing them. But yeah, we've seen sort of a nice showing from the internal folks. But we just do the sort of education on what a tune-up is and not necessarily all the technical stuff.
Great, thank you. Related question, this is probably a quick one. What's the typical tune-up cost that you're seeing for owners? It
ranges quite a bit, but I think most commonly we see it in a range from like 20 cents a square foot to 25 cents a square foot, depending on the nature of the building and the provider. So that's for audit and implement. That's for the audit and implementation,
including implementing the measures that are done on the spot. As you have seen this roll out, how does the tune-up policy interact with utility EE programs? You talked a little bit about it and mentioned the Washington State program, but or policy rather. What's the landscape of interaction there?
All kinds of interaction. So first of all, we had the Seattle City Light offered the incentives for the accelerator, so they can provide incentives just for doing the tune-up as long as it's in advance of the deadline. We have a bunch of off-ramps for utility retrocommissioning programs that both Puget Sound Energy and Seattle City Light offer. If they have sort of, I think at least PSC offers a sort of tune-up that's a little bit more stringent than our tune-up. We allow incentives for that and compliance through that. But also on the sort of voluntary measures, buildings can go back to after we identify those opportunities for replacement. They can get incentives still for lighting replacement, equipment upgrades. All that stuff still plays out after the fact if building owners want to take advantage of those opportunities. And as far as the state goes, there's sort of a lot of interaction between us and the state. We've been heavily involved in the policy development process and in the rules development process. So, we hope that, I think we don't have any sort of clarity from the state on whether or not the utilities can continue to offer incentives for all of what they're requiring, but we're at least well aligned with the state on they'll allow us to continue running our benchmarking and tune-ups policies, and sort of
thank you.
Buildings in the city will be ahead of the curve on that in terms of getting ready to comply with the state.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to bring our session to a close there. Once again, big thank you to our three panelists today for this discussion, and big thank you and hello to all the fellow energy policy nerds out there. Thanks for tuning in and engaging with us, hearing these conversations, and coming back at us all with questions. We appreciate you all making it work in this virtual environment, and we'll see you in the next session.